Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the May 23rd meeting of the Eugene City Council. Mayor Venus is not present with us physically, but is on the phone so that she can participate in the conversation. And because it's challenging for someone to run a meeting while being somewhere else and not being able to see all of us, I simply will try and facilitate the conversation today. We have on our agenda the opportunity to have a further work session on the issue of accessory and secondary dwelling units, and I'll turn it over to Christy to get us started. How's that?
I'm Christy Hammond, Assistant City Manager. I'm sitting in today for City Manager John Reese, and I'll just turn it right over to Robin and Alyssa from our Planning Department.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Did you?
No.
All right, great.
Greg.
I'm just going to give you a little recap, and just for clarity, I'm going to use the term secondary dwelling because that's what's in our land use code at this time, but not to be confused that those are the same as an accessory dwelling. So as you recall, you held a public hearing on 3 ordinances back in mid-April, and you had a phenomenal attendance at that. You had 54 speakers, and you heard a broad range of perspectives, all the way from you need to do a whole lot more to implement Senate Bill 1051 to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is you don't need to do anything to implement 1051, which is why we're probably here today. You left the record open for 2 weeks and received more testimony during that time frame. And then you met just on May 14th to discuss 3 proposed ordinances and possibly take action. You did take action on one of the ordinances, which was pertaining to housing on church property, which would allow them to have 2 homes, whereas there's kind of a gap in the code right now. And then you also voted to postpone discussion on 2 ordinances that are related to secondary dwellings. One would expand the number of zones where they're allowed, and the other one would align the definition with that provided in Senate Bill 1051. You also had a fair number of questions as an outcome of your discussion, really around clarification of terms and definitions, and then some questions about phase 2 timing and scope. So we provided you a memo on this Monday. Robin emailed it to you, and that provided hopefully the answers to your questions. Obviously, we're happy to expand on those as needed. And then we also posed 3 questions for you that we're hoping to get answers from today. The first would be, does council wish to replace the term secondary dwelling with the term accessory dwelling throughout the code? While there are like about 108 references, it would be a pretty easy, cut and, replace and search and replace for that. And it has really no practical effect on policy implications or regulations. It's just merely changing a name. Second question would be, among the zones where secondary dwellings are proposed to be added, and that's in Ordinance 1, are there any zone that council feels should be removed from the ordinance? And just a reminder, the zones that are being added are agricultural, AG agricultural, R2, which is medium density residential, R3, which is limited high density residential, R4, high density residential, and then a couple of special area zones, Elmira and Blair. And then because it's proposed to be added to R2, and the Jefferson West Side Special Area Zone relies on R2, it would also be added there as well based on the proposed ordinance. And then the last question is, are there any existing development standards that currently apply to secondary dwellings that you wish to modify or remove? And this could include any development standards that you believe or feel are unrelated to siting and design or not reasonable. And that could be, so development standards could be parking, owner occupancy, building height, setbacks, kind of et cetera. So those are all we have. We're happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. I think based on the fact that this is a work session and this is the subject of our day today, I think we'll start out with a discussion. If there's hands for people in the queue, I see Betty and Emily and Claire. Okay, Betty.
I'm of the opinion, which has been expressed by some very knowledgeable people, that we don't really need to do anything, that we already allow secondary dwellings. I don't understand why it would make a difference if we change the name to accessory.
That was just something that was raised
Yeah, I
at
know,
last
but
week's discussion, and it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't really have, it doesn't have a practical effect. It would just bring it in alignment with Senate Bill 1051 and what other cities in Oregon typically call them. But
Senate
it's
Bill 1051 didn't say very much.
correct.
When you talk about
That is
getting
true.
into alignment, that is, and what would, if I, it seems to me we're spending time on something that's unnecessary. But if, I want to know if we pass the first ordinance, for example, what would be different from what exists now?
What would be different? Well, the secondary dwelling would be allowed in those 7 zones that I just mentioned.
And they're not now?
A secondary dwelling by nature is not allowed. Some of those zones allow a second dwelling, but it's not a secondary dwelling. And I think the memo, well, I know the memo went into a little bit of detail on the difference between those, which, to a casual observer may look the same, but we have a distinct definition and a line item in our use table for secondary dwelling.
Well, there are some places that you think that would be able to have secondary dwellings if we pass that ordinance,
Correct,
which aren't now.
correct.
And, well, I'd like to know why that would be desirable. And you mentioned that you're talking about phase 2, that when you mentioned owner occupancy, setbacks and so forth, right?
Well, I mean, if the question is, I mean, we had originally talked about those being part of phase 2, but if there are any that the council feels that need to be addressed now, then that would be important for us to know.
Okay, well, I think they're very reasonable requirements and that we should not do anything about them. That's a strong opinion, and I think it's a strong opinion of people in the neighborhoods too. Especially owner occupancy should not be changed. And setbacks, because that has to do with livability of the neighborhood. And for parking, that's a more complicated, I think it would depend on where it is, but more parked cars could really cause problems in some neighborhoods. And I'm waiting to see what, the second ordinance we have, what would that change?
That would change the definition of secondary dwelling.
yeah.
So this was one of the Planning Commission's recommendations. They wanted it to align with the definition provided in Senate Bill 1051.
Which really isn't in Senate Bill 1051.
It is in Senate Bill 1051. I mean,
There's not a definition.
there is a definition. It's in Senate Bill 1051 of, it says accessory dwelling means, and then it spells out what it is.
Okay, I guess, thank you.
Emily?
Thank you. My biggest concern is density issues, especially in the Jefferson and the Chambers special area zones, which follow R2. I had been told that originally the special area zones would trump the new ones and not have to be under that rule. But right now, if we change R2 to allowing each single dwelling house to have an SDU, and we already allow 2 single dwelling units on a lot in R2, we're putting the potential to have 4 buildings on that lot. And with the general density parameter of 14 units per acre, I think that has the chance to increase density beyond that. And the neighbors from those 2 special area zones are very vocal that, one, they agree, and I do also with Betty, that we don't have to do anything. But if we do, it's very important to me that we put in that it will not affect SDUs in the special area zones. And that's really my biggest thing. Small question, what's a flag lot and a pole width? But it's probably not really applicable today. And then can you have both an accessory dwelling unit and an accessory building? Is there any restrictions on that?
No, there are not. You can have, because an accessory building is like a shed or a detached garage or a chicken coop. So you can have that in conjunction with a secondary dwelling or accessory dwelling, whatever you want to call it. The limiting factor, say in R1, would be lot coverage. So you can't cover your whole lot with buildings. You're limited to 50%.
Okay. I think that's my biggest problem is the special area zones and the density and respecting the work that those neighborhoods put in, which was extensive for how they want their neighborhoods to be. There's other things that I care about a little bit, but that's really where I'm at right now.
And just to clarify, there have been, the ordinance doesn't propose or contain any changes to the density requirements or to the requirements of the number of homes that would be allowed in the special area zone, so it would still be capped. I know there have been questions about what if council eliminated density, but that's not something that is proposed under this ordinance.
So if right now we keep it at 14 dwellings per lot, and people start putting them in, and it approaches that, who gets, left out? How do you pick who gets to build them first? Just by who gets in line first?
Well, there's actually, secondary dwellings are subject to density requirements. So somebody couldn't build a secondary dwelling if it exceeded density requirements in that zone.
So that would, but you're not counting SDUs.
Yes, secondary dwellings are counted towards density.
I've been hearing they are not.
Okay.
So that's really important.
I think a clarification to one of the questions that was asked prior was that historically Eugene did not count SDUs in terms of density, but currently does as of 2014.
And will it stay that way?
Yes, unless council decided to change that.
Okay, well, that's helpful, but I would still like to put in a motion that the special area zones are protected.
Okay, Claire.
Thank you. So is the language here in attachment A the same as what we had at our last?
Yeah, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed to the ordinances.
So I still have a concern about our interchangeable use of secondary and accessory, but I don't know if it's such a strong concern that I would push us to go through the amendment to a land use code to make all those changes. The interest is to reduce confusion and to have clarity for folks when they look at the code, but I'm willing to let that go. Regarding the questions you asked us, I am interested, but I think these could wait till phase 2, but I am interested partly because, as someone else mentioned at this table, people have put a lot of work into, various issues within their own neighborhoods, and there's, energy out in the community about some of these possible changes. But so I am interested when we get to phase 2 to look at the owner occupancy requirement. I have heard from constituents who, want to live in the secondary dwelling unit and have someone else occupy the main house, that was the plan for their accessory dwelling unit, to be the mother-in-law in the mother-in-law cottage while owning the property. And they can't do that under our current code.
They can if they own the property. Only one
I thought it was expressed that they had to live in the main building.
One of the units. Nope, only one of the units.
Well, then that's a misunderstanding that people have about our code. And I'm hearing that it may be partly how our language is written that's contributing to that confusion.
Say that again, Claire? What you could.
So people are under the impression that if they have a secondary dwelling unit, they have to live in the primary building on the property as the owner occupant, and they cannot live in the secondary dwelling unit and rent out the primary building on the property.
They just have to, the current standards, and actually it's been this way for a long time, they just need to live in one of the units.
two.
Yeah, one of the two houses.
Well, I still think there's some room to look at that question in general, in terms of thinking about how we maximize density throughout the city. I'm also interested in looking at removing the restriction on minimum lot size. If we have other limitations on how big a building is and setbacks, it seems to me that those will in some case take care of an issue of a certain lot size and prescribe where things can be built. And then I understand, and this may be a misinterpretation too, but I'd also be interested in looking at parts of the code that limit whether an accessory dwelling unit can be built as attached to the main house versus a detached garage. So my understanding is right now that that's not allowed, that if your garage is detached from your main house and you cannot build a qualifying secondary dwelling unit attached to that garage.
There's a little nuance to that, of course, but it's if your garage is over 300 square feet, it's a bit of a strange. I think when it was written, the intent was if somebody was building, and probably based on some enforcement issues, honestly, that people would build a 3-car garage, put an SDU over and then suddenly it was a 2-car garage, and they started to build living area in the lower part, and so. What ended up out of 2014 was to place a limit on the size of garage that could be built with a secondary dwelling, but it has that effect of if you have an existing garage and you want to put, and you heard testimony to that, if you have an existing garage that's over 300 square feet, that's going to be problematic.
Okay, so I just think there are some details within the code that are creating barriers that we could be looking at, but I'm willing to wait till phase 2 for that.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm sorry, I didn't make good notes, and I was listening so intently, I forgot some of the things I was going to say. My first question is about what Emily was talking about, having different standards for different areas. Like, for example, you mentioned the Jefferson West Side area, and how they went through that huge process. So my understanding is that they do allow secondary dwelling units in? No, they do not.
They allow second homes, second houses, which is a distinct line item in our code as a secondary dwelling. So they do allow a second home there. The way it's structured, if secondary dwellings are permitted in that zone, instead of that second house, they could build an SDU. We'll just say that.
They can't build a small house, they have to build a larger one.
Well, they could build a small house. We would just call it a second single-family home instead of a secondary dwelling. It's a little bit semantics, but there's a distinct line item in the code. There is a separate definition. We review them, we count them differently.
Emily.
So,
Not Emily, not that.
is this on? Yeah. Far be it for the lawyer to try to provide the layperson's understanding of this, but let me give it a shot. So, because I just talked with Alyssa about this, trying to get my head around it, let me see if I can explain what I think was your question and what you're hearing now. Currently, in R2, R3, R4, and I think Jefferson West Side, because it refers to R2, maybe others, where you can do 2 homes on 1 lot. What that means is what you would consider an SDU or an ADU as being maybe smaller accessory, that's a subset of what is already allowed there. If someone came in right now and said, I live in R2, and I would like to do a second home on my lot, and it's going to be small, and I'm going to live in one of these, the answer would be, yeah, that's permitted if you meet the criteria or the standards for size and all those sorts of things. That is permitted right now. It's just not called an SDU because we allow a larger subset of those kinds of homes. It doesn't actually, the answer would be, well, that's cool if you want to live in it, and it's fine that it's small, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
The question is it required to be explicit?
So there are a number of good reasons, and I can let planners talk to you.
I'm saying required. Is it required to be explicit?
Under the state law, no. It's much easier to defend if it's explicit.
And it's certainly more clear for those of us who administer the code and take in permits and monitor those permits to understand what type of dwelling, we're reviewing, what type of dwelling we're monitoring in the future. I mean, there's a lot of practical effects, and our code does have a distinction in terms of the uses.
So I guess what's the advantage of changing that? Is that so that you can build an SDU and a second unit? Is that?
No, you would get one or the other. I mean, you'd still be allowed, I mean, if it's a lot that would allow 2 homes, you can either call it, you can either have 2 single-family homes, or you can have a single-family home and a secondary dwelling. I am not sure, I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure too many people would want to build the SDU instead of, because of, right now, there's, the regulations that are around it. Somebody would probably just want to build a second house, and it wouldn't matter, it could be any size as long as it met lot coverage. That being said, I mean, the reason we're adding it is because we believe that 1051 requires that we explicitly allow it in our residential zones. That, I guess you said something slightly different, but I mean, based on our interpretation of that, we have added it to the residential zones that allow single-family dwellings.
But it's not required.
I guess I don't understand why some neighbors are so against it then.
I think the concern is similar to what Councilor Semple said. If at some point the council decides or determines or gets told that secondary dwellings, don't count towards density, then what you're mentioning could happen. You have your 2 single-family homes on your lot, and then would you get 2 SDUs? And so it's kind of that I think it's really a density question. I don't think right now anybody has a problem if that house is called a secondary dwelling or a second single-family dwelling. I think the concern, as I understand it, is if the density requirements go away.
Okay. I guess I'm done for now. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you. Actually, Emily's comments were actually helpful, because it begins to sound to me like it's less a material change in terms of actual physical building or lots, and more of an effort to clarify or to create more clarity around what do terms mean and what's this and that. So if right now today I could build a tiny home in the backyard of my R2 zoned property, and after this all passed, that still would be true. It just is an increase in clarification.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, it may be if it's tiny, it would, based on the way the ordinance is written, it would be required to meet the secondary dwelling standards that are in the residential zone. But correct, it would bring a lot more clarity, which is something we heard loud and clear at your last work session, amongst the terms being used.
So that the concern that by passing these, we would somehow open the floodgates of a whole lot of things being suddenly built in people's backyards isn't really what this is about.
Yeah, and it's not something that's proposed in the ordinance before you either, to change density. It's certainly been raised. You heard it in testimony. It's something the Planning Commission heard in testimony.
Okay. Does anything in what we might potentially pass today get rid of or reduce what gets counted in the density?
Not that I believe. I
Okay.
don't know. I
So
mean,
the
that was the
concern
intent.
that this would somehow allow a lot of additional building on a lot would not occur, because the density calculation and what is or is not allowed in the density calculation remains the same.
Right. So that has not changed.
Okay. So it's not that we don't allow them and where we are allowing them. We do allow them, but there's a lot of unclear
We allow
definitions
them
and
under a
terms around it.
different name, I
Under a
guess,
different
would
name.
be the way to frame it. But
Okay.
for those of us who review these and administer the land use code, I would say, no, we don't allow them. We allow a second single-family home.
So you would say, no, we don't allow it as a matter of technical
Yeah, I mean,
parlance,
it's really
not as a practical element.
correct.
But if we create more clarity around this code, would that make it easier for someone to apply for a permit and build a secondary dwelling as opposed to the way it is now?
In those zones, I don't believe so. I don't think it would be any, they could decide which route they wanted to go.
Okay. Because one of my goals, one of the outcomes I'm looking for is to remove the obstacles to building secondary dwelling units in a way that doesn't destroy neighborhood livability. I think they're not mutually exclusive, but I just want to make sure that what we're doing doesn't create an unintended consequence. And it sounds like this is really more for the interests of clarifying things as opposed to creating new building systems or new ways of creating dwelling units.
I don't see this as adding the allowance for additional dwellings in those zones, in the R2, R3, R4, above and beyond what's already allowed. It's just a particular type.
Okay, but those questions may have to come back up again in terms of the conversation around phase two.
Absolutely.
Okay, but not today, not this.
Not as crafted,
Okay.
correct.
Okay, good. That's important, and I think that was where you began to let the light bulb go off a little in my head, that this is less about changing the code to facilitate more building, at least for today. This is more to clarify things so that people who read it can understand exactly what we're talking about, but nothing really materially changes.
Right. I mean, unless there's some kind of incentive or facilitative program further down the line that is, absolutely specific to secondary dwellings as opposed to units of, houses of a certain size. That could be the only thing I could see would be a benefit, but that's not something we're counting on at this point, nor is it a reason to add these.
Okay. Also, as Claire said, if it's going to be a lot of trouble and expense to change the language to match whatever the state does, I can live with SDU if that's okay. I can tell the difference in my head, as long as there is not some sort of a clarity issue for you, in which case I'm happy to talk about it.
And I honestly, it might be a little bit of work to pull out those sections. I don't think it's that difficult of a task, and according to Emily, we could attach it to one of these ordinances with that, if that's what you mentioned.
Yeah, it's not even, it wouldn't require another public hearing or anything. It doesn't really change anything substantively. And if it's something that you think will help users to use that same term, we're not advising you against it in any way, I don't think.
No. And I did a little bit of research just looking at what other cities were, how they defined accessory building versus accessory dwelling. And the 5 that I looked at all used accessory dwelling. Portland, Bend, Corvallis, Gresham, Salem, all used accessory dwelling.
So my final question would be, in your opinion, as the professional staff person, would you say it's better and more clear for us to go ahead and amend it to add that change? Would you recommend changing it to accessory dwelling unit?
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you.
Okay, I put myself in the queue here, but then Alan jumped in. I'm gonna go ahead and go and then call on Alan. Got a bunch of stuff here though, so I'll probably need a second round. Robin, you said something really interesting to me, and I just want to double check that I heard this right, and maybe put some prescriptive detail around it. Right now, for the sake of density, we count anything that has the word dwelling associated with it. Is that correct?
I'm not sure exactly what the letter of the code says, but currently, if it's an accessory dwelling, it does get counted towards density. And I think that's done.
Isn't dwelling the critical word there?
I think
It depends on the, it really, I can speak to the residential zones. It explicitly says all dwellings, including secondary dwellings, shall meet minimum and maximum density
That requires
requirements.
an act of council to alter, is that correct?
Correct. It's
Okay.
in the land use code.
no intention.
Yeah, so one of my critical things is to protect R1. For me, the property rights that we're protecting with R1, because it's the only zone that protects the single-family home owner and their property rights. And I view that as a primary role of government, is to protect people's rights. So for me, if there are 43,000 square feet in a square acre and our maximum density in R1 is 14.2, when you do the long division, it's 3,000 square feet. Thus, I don't want to build 2 structures on anything smaller than 6,000 square feet. And did I hear you say that we don't do that, or that isn't
Well, there's
possible
also,
to do?
so in R1, currently, there's a minimum lot size. You have to have a lot that is 6,100 square feet
Correct.
in order to construct a secondary dwelling.
And we don't have any plans to change that, is that correct?
That is, so none of the development standards, which that is included, are proposed to be changed as a result of the ordinances in front of you.
One of the other things about 1051 is it also mentions something about clear and objective language. Do you have it in front of you in order to review that or read it and refresh my memory?
It's a different section, I'm guessing, of 1051, because that 1051 I know was addressed about 6 different things.
Specifically with regard to definitions.
It's the one thing in this giant stack that I
Yeah.
don't have is 1051.
So I have the entire bill. It's
Oh, good.
15 pages. I'm not sure which you're,
Well, let me get down to the nuts of it. We're going to get sued either way, right? I mean, reasonably.
We're going to get appealed.
We're going to get appealed one way or another,
I would
no
say
matter
yes.
what we do.
I think so.
So I want to err on the side of protecting people's rights. That's what I want to do. And at the same time, I want to see us build an awful lot more housing in our community than we have access to right now. So I want to preserve the widest possibility of opportunity. It's my read, and based on what I know, that, like I just clarified with you, that 1051 does not require us to be explicit about SDUs in 2, 3, and 4. Am I right about that? It doesn't
Right.
require us to be explicitly calling them out.
Right. In other words, if you took the current language out that adds SDUs to those zones, in court, I would say it's okay because we functionally already allow them, as you can see, and I would
Right.
walk the court through what
Right.
Alyssa just walked you through.
And so people who would apply would get a yes either way.
Right. I mean, presumably, it's
Right.
not going to change what they.
Adding that, my concern is when we get to phase 2 and some of those other discussions, I absolutely do not want incentives to apply only to SDUs. I want us to be, as we've said as a council, looking at a variety of housing types and incentivizing a larger diversity of housing types. And as Alan is fond of saying, one solution, and in this case SDUs, are not the silver bullet for housing in our community. We need silver buckshot. So I don't want us to just incentivize SDUs. I want to see cottage clusters and everything else incentivized. So that's why I'm concerned about calling it out and being explicit in 2, 3, and 4, because I don't want us to then say, oh, but now that we have this definition, suddenly that's the only thing that we can incentivize, and that concerns me. And so that's why I hesitate with calling it out explicitly. And when it's 7 seconds, I wish we had DLCD to talk to because we're going to be appealed. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to put myself in a second round.
Just to clarify, an appeal wouldn't go to DLCD. DLCD
They could give us
is
some.
an agency. An appeal would go to the Land Use Board of Appeals, which is a completely different body, and an appeal from it would go to the Court of Appeals. So
Okay.
those are the people we'd like to have at the table.
Alan, but they could give us guidance.
Well-
Alan,
Which isn't really of much use at LCDC. So if there ever was an issue that screamed out for more clarity, it's this one. And I agree with Chris that we should do everything we possibly can to create as much clarity as we possibly can in this circumstance and the code here. I wish I had $1 for when I was canvassing for everybody that asked me, what the heck's the difference between an SDU and an AD, accessory dwelling unit? And then you'd say, nothing. And they'd say, then why are there two different names? And I'd go, well, I don't know. And in fact, almost everybody else calls it accessory dwelling units. We're one of the few, if not the only one, that says secondary dwelling units. And in fact, we used to call it accessory dwelling units and changed it to secondary dwelling units in 2001. So I'm totally on board with going and adopting accessory dwelling units and just obliterating secondary dwelling units because nobody else uses it, and it just creates a lot of confusion, and it makes no difference at all in what we're trying to do here. So just getting everybody on the same page and getting rid of confusion is of one of my concerns. The other concern that I have is around protecting livability and the impacts of livability on neighborhoods and especially in R1, and at the same time balancing increase in affordable housing. I agree with you, Mike. ADUs are included in that list, but it goes well beyond all the things between single-family and multifamily large complexes that are the affordable or missing middle housing that we need to incentivize and get more of to create more affordable housing. And I'm not real worried about just getting pigeonholed into ADUs as far as doing incentives. So, and I also haven't heard anybody talk about any intention to change or get rid of the density requirement. So I think that's a red herring I think people brought up. I did have a question about one thing that Emily said, which is special protections for the special area zones. And I wasn't clear about what that meant and what's its impact. Maybe both of you can, maybe you can
I'm
address what
actually
you were
not
talking
sure
about.
either,
and then-
so, yeah, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Emily is next up, by the way, in the queue, just FYI.
And so then, so maybe you can address that when you get to your time. So then, all this discussion that we need to have that adds more clarity is the stuff that I think we should be talking about in phase 2, which will be starting very soon. And we have a long laundry list of stuff that we'll be talking about in that, including owner occupancy. What does that mean? What about the parking requirements? What about the height and setback, lot size versus 50% lot coverage, and all these different things that need more conversation before we just move forward with them. And I agree that those things put in phase 2 makes us, adds more weight to that conversation and also makes us want to get through it to get to the more clarity, which is kind of the primary purpose of all of this in the first place, as well as balancing livability with getting more affordable housing. So maybe Emily, you can just address the special protections for special area zones.
Well, unfortunately, I haven't read.
Is this your round now?
Yeah, it's
Second
fine.
round. Here we go. Thank you.
I haven't read the whole text of the special area zones, and I had meant to print out some papers before I got here, but my printer does not work. The main thing I'm hearing is the concern about density, because if you add in, and here's my question, is it to every single family dwelling, or is it to every lot that you can have one SDU? Because if it's per single-family dwelling, and we add this R2 change, then every single-family dwelling that's on the right lot size can have 4 buildings. Is that true? Is it per house, or is it per lot?
The way it is, it says one, okay, it says it allows a secondary dwelling, 1 per detached one-family dwelling on same lot. And then if you go to the Jefferson West Side, it tells you if you have a lot between this size and this size, you're allowed this many dwellings, and that would include your secondary dwelling. So it doesn't give you additional beyond what's already allowed in the Jefferson West Side zone.
Well, it does if you get an SDU per single-family house.
You still have to meet because Jefferson West Side says if you're, and I don't have it right in front of me, but if your lots between this size and this size, you're allowed, 2 dwelling units, and one of those would be the secondary dwelling. You don't get an additional, you can't exceed the density that's currently required to be met in the zone.
So if you have every single smallest size lot next to you in R2, and they all build an SDU, you're still going to be under the density requirements.
So in R2, you have to have a minimum lot size of 6,100 square feet, which puts you about right at 14 units an acre. So you're not going to have tiny lots being able to do a secondary dwelling based on your density requirements in the land use code.
Well, I'm skeptical of that.
I'd be happy to walk you through those code sections. Maybe now's not the time, but
Probably not. Have we looked into what other cities are doing? I hear Springfield's, everybody's happy. What are they doing? How are other cities complying?
sure. So I probably didn't bring the Springfield information, but they removed barriers in their low-density residential zone. They removed owner occupancy. They removed parking. They also added it in their equivalent to their multifamily zones, so their medium density and their high density. And in those, it is they do have to comply with density.
So the whole point of this was to increase the number of SDUs, but I think I just heard you say that it wouldn't change.
Well-
That everybody who could have an SDU already has that ability. So it's not really going to change density.
The point is to comply with the state law, which says that we need to allow in areas zoned for detached single-family dwellings, the development of at least one accessory dwelling unit for each detached single-family dwelling. And that's what we're trying to comply with here. There's the second section that talks about subject to reasonable local regulations relating to siting and design. By and large, we're going to see most secondary dwellings in R1. If I didn't bring a zoning map, but the vast majority of our residential zoning in Eugene is R1, low-density residential. They're already allowed there. That's where we're going to see most of them. This frees up, some other properties to allow that. It's not going to, we're not going to see a floodgate of secondary dwellings as a result of these ordinances. But we do believe that it complies with the intent of the Senate bill.
So where does it allow SDUs that aren't allowed now?
So it would allow, I know it's semantics, but we have a line item in the code that's called secondary dwelling. Right now, they're only permitted in R1 and a couple of our special area zones. This would add it to AG. It would add it to R2, R3, R4, and a couple of the special area zones.
Which can also already have a second
They can have a second
unit.
dwelling.
So how is it going to actually get more buildings than we have now?
I've never, I can't tell you that it would get you more buildings. It would definitely be clarity. Also, I know maybe at your level this doesn't matter, but on a practical level, when we get a building permit in, we need to know what it is. And so if they just write second dwelling, that's not, is it a secondary dwelling? Is it not? Which review process does it need? The definition actually makes a big difference to us. Also in monitoring, we track how many secondary dwellings we get, how many single-family dwellings we get. And so if these are coming in as single-family dwellings, we're not going to count them as secondary dwellings. We don't have somebody who's down there, monitoring all of that. We're going to be basing it on the permit they submitted, which is going to be for a single-family dwelling. So really, to me, from a practical level, the name matters a lot.
Clarity.
Yes.
So if you had 17, 6 and 6, so if you had a 1,300 square foot lot, then you could build 2 single-family dwellings and 2 SDUs because it would be one for each and you wouldn't increase the density?
I cannot do math on the fly, so I'm going to apologize for that. You want to tell me how many dwelling units per acre that gets you? I don't.
What was the first part? Because,
I can do it if I can pull my calculator
We'll
out.
give you the same dwelling units per acre, but my original question was, can you have an SDU for each single-family dwelling as long as it meets the lot size required? I want to know if you can have 4 dwelling units in R2 on a big enough lot size.
You'd have to have a 12,000 square foot lot. But
So there are lots that, and people do this. They don't just build apartments in our multifamily zones. There are some, folks who choose to build individual cottages or, a number of homes.
that's the question, though. Can you do it on less than a 12,000 square foot lot?
And that I can't do off the top of my head.
With 2 houses, it's R2, so it doesn't matter. It's not the same density requirement.
If I may, I think the concerns, the concerns around density are hypothetical at this point. There isn't anything on the table that would change that would change the density requirements at all. So I know folks have brought up that concern. We've had questions about it. We've answered those questions hypothetically. And the risk in doing that is it's interpreted as being something that's being considered right now, but it's not. So I just wanted to clarify that there is no change to the density requirements
Do we have
being
any,
proposed right now.
do we have any idea what any other cities are doing to comply with 1051?
I know what Springfield has done to comply with 1051. and
So
that's-
everybody else is waiting to the last minute?
I haven't had time to research what anybody else is doing, honestly. That's something we can follow up and see what a couple other cities are doing. I believe Salem was one of the cities who didn't used to even allow secondary or accessory dwellings, and they recently changed their code as well.
And we need to get on with phase 2 as quickly as possible to get through it, because during that time, people can sue us for things they think should be in it that aren't.
Thank you, Emily. I'm in the queue now, and then Chris, I will say, you have said repeatedly in that last two exchanges that the code that we have currently allows accessory or secondary dwelling units in R1. Yes?
Correct.
Emily just said that 1051 does not explicitly require us to be explicit about SDUs in 2, 3, and 4. So, if, and this is my point, if the question was, what does 1051 require us to do, I would suggest that when I said the other day, we already comply. I think there are questions about the manner issues, the standard stuff that we need in phase 2 to work through. But I think, and as far as we already know we're going to get sued, I think we already comply with 1051 except. The definition issue is also sticky for me, and I know there's a portion of it, we didn't call it out here, but it says you want to be as clear and objective as possible. It's something we're doing with clear and objective standards here that's coming up. I want our code to be as clear as possible. I agree with Chris about clarity there. So I'm going to suggest that it would be my preference to come back to us with a definition of accessory dwelling units to adopt, and adopt that we replace secondary dwelling units with accessory dwelling units in all of those places, and with a definition of accessory dwelling units that's extremely clear and objective, that leaves no room for subjectivity whatsoever. Now, that may require, asking outside folks, DLCD, other lawyers, whatever we need to do. But I don't want to leave any wiggle room in that basic definition if we're going to apply it everywhere. That would be my preference. Emily?
The second ordinance in your packet, the one recommended by Planning Commission, includes only the amendment of the definition of
For secondary dwelling units.
which I understand. I anticipate a motion to change that to accessory.
Right.
And it would have us replace our current definition with the one from state law, which
Is that clear and objective to everyone's satisfaction?
Well, I'll read it in case it's an interior attached or detached residential structure that is used in connection with or that is accessory to a single-family dwelling. I would say that may or may not be very clear. It's
I
what
would
the state
suggest,
gave us.
as we have all said, that the state statute was neither clear or objective in its suggestion of specifics to us, and that was kind of left to us. And I don't think that definition is either. And so again, I'm just speaking my bit at my time here.
So what we would ask of you, because that is a policy and not a legal question, is specifically how would you like us to change this definition?
Okay.
So, some language, talk about it,
Okay. I don't have that right in front of me, but I do have some suggestions on that based on conversations with other people. And I know that there are other experts in the field that I would like to consult with if that's going to be left to all of us. But I would ask staff to be to also give us their ideas of what would be as clear and objective a language as is possible if we're going to redefine in our code accessory dwelling unit rather than secondary dwelling unit in all of those places, to be as clear as we can be about what we mean.
Councilor Clark, the way that the definitions work in our code is they generally aren't used as sort of the test of what something is alone. So in deciding how you might want to change this, my recommendation would be to look at the list of standards we currently apply. Essentially, that tells you how staff currently define a secondary dwelling or
I
accessory
appreciate
dwelling.
your suggestion, but I want clarity, and I think that we have at least the possibility to be a great deal more clear than we have been so far. Now, lastly, I'd like to say to Emily's point, how much money are we spending in River Road and around the university area in order to allow those neighborhoods to write their own refinement plans and to tell us specifically in detail how they'd like development to happen? Jefferson Westside and Chambers have already done that work for us, and I think we ought to respect it. And when they're saying You know, this is what we meant when we created this as a series of neighborhoods. I think we owe it to them, just like we're spending all this money around River Road and the university, to respect what the neighbors have given us. And that's my comment on Emily's. I have Chris.
Thank you. And yeah, if I'm going to pass something, I want it to be as clear as possible. So if you need to come back with a refined definition of accessory dwelling unit, that's perfectly fine. And I think it should be, as Emily says, built on kind of the existing methodology we use to define that, whatever that looks like. And if people want to have input on it, I think that's great too, but I would depend on you to come back with the best definition of an accessory dwelling unit per the code that we have, and one that is consistent with the spirit of 1051, but also achieves the clarity, which I agree we all want. I will just ask this flat out, just for my own edification. Is the work that we're proposing to do today a secret bureaucratic way to allow us to build more SDUs in R1, R2, R3, R4 residential neighborhoods?
No.
Okay. So this is more for clarity, not for some backhanded way to get a lot more buildings in neighborhoods?
Correct.
Okay. 13 years ago, when we were talking about this exact same issue, I referred to it as the whack-a-mole issue, because when you try to accommodate the needs of one group, the mole just pops up somewhere else. And when you try to deal with it from that standpoint, it pops up somewhere else. And the conflict has always been, as Mike so appropriately points out, people want to preserve their property rights to have the kind of home they want to have. At the same time, we're trying to accommodate 45,000 people that are coming, or even more. How do you accommodate 45,000 people that are coming and still preserve the people's desire to have my nice, neighborhood home? And I recognize both sides are right. And I think part of the reason Senate Bill 100 was passed was to prevent us from taking the easy way out, which is, yeah, it's easy to accommodate both of those. You just get bigger, you sprawl. That really is a very attractive solution because it's so easy. Everybody gets what they want. And I think Senate Bill 100 was passed to prevent us from taking the easy way out. So what we're struggling with right now is trying to figure out a way to accommodate that 45,000 people and still try to allow us to preserve as much individual property right as possible. And that's why it's so important for you to be able to explicitly say, our goal here is not to just stuff 45,000 people into neighborhoods, but to figure out a way to do it effectively. And that's why we're doing it so slowly and so deliberately. And so I'm okay with the pace, but I don't want the pace to slow down to the point where we actually stop and it stalls. So that's where I'm so dependent on you to provide us that ongoing direction so we can try to maintain that balance.
I have Jennifer, and then Alan, Claire, and Betty.
Yeah, thank you. So for the definition, if we're going to work on that, what I would like something on is used in connection with, and that is accessory to. I have no idea what that is supposed to mean. Like, I can guess, but used in connection with, like, that's just, that doesn't even make sense. So it would be nice if we can decide what that means to us. Like, I don't necessarily care what Corvallis or Springfield or Bend is doing. Like, we need to decide what that means for us, and then we can have a definition, and people will be able to understand what it means. I don't think that these changes that we're going to make are going to affect all neighborhoods equally. I think that there will be places where it is going to be much more attractive to build these for some folks than in other areas. And my concern is in these areas that have put a lot of work into their special area plans, it could potentially make a difference, not intentionally, but sometimes unintentionally. And I'm not convinced, like Emily, that there isn't going to be some kind of negative consequence. And maybe I'm wrong, but I feel very uncomfortable making changes to these areas that spent so much time and effort and were so applauded for it, to just make these blanket changes. So I would also be in favor if we can make an exception for the special area zones until we can go back. And I think it'd be very appropriate to take a close look at all of them and decide what we want to do. But I don't know. This just makes me very uncomfortable to make big changes.
Finished?
I'm done.
Thank you. Alan?
Yeah, again, around clarity, I want to try to avoid confusion, and I also want to get better definitions, but I don't think we should conflate the two issues. I think that they should be separate. And the definition of an accessory dwelling unit is actually kind of complicated. Obviously, we're not going to do it at this table, and I think it actually is related to the provisions that we put in the code. So if we're going to go through phase 2 and change some of that, we're going to change the definition of accessory dwelling unit. So I don't think this is the time to change the definition. It's in phase 2, because what we do in phase 2 is going to affect that. So in that regard, I would like to clarify that we don't use the word secondary dwelling unit any longer, and that we just use accessory dwelling unit like everybody else. So I will move to direct the city manager to revise the ordinance to replace the land use code's use of the term secondary dwelling with the term accessory dwelling.
Second?
Okay, we're going to start a new queue for discussion of the motion. And would anyone like to have discussion of that motion? I'm looking around, I'm not seeing any. Betty?
I'm concerned about the definition of accessory was used in connection with. And I wonder, a lot of people have large garages, and that they can turn that into a dwelling unit. They sometimes turn it into a bedroom for the part of the family, but they could also rent it out. How does that fit in? It's very easy to convert. My garage has he did it already, and a lot of garages do it. And most of them I've seen in my neighborhood, which is R1. A lot of people have turned them into dwelling places. Is that an accessory dwelling?
It depends if it's an independent, if it's used for occupancy. Yeah, I mean, it really, does it have a kitchen? Does it have a bathroom? Is it just a living area? Because I lived in a house that had a converted garage, but it was just, it was the playroom. So it kind of depends if it's a separate dwelling, or is it just living area? And dwelling is also defined in the land use code, just to, add that.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to put myself in there, and I actually, this is a discussion I'd love to have. I know that's not our style, but I want to vote for your motion because I like the idea of us talking about this in the same language that everybody else in the state does and the statute does. That, to me, seems like it makes a lot of sense for clarity, and I really like that. But at the same time, for me, I don't think the definition is unimportant, because we just proved it. It lends to a question about, okay, well, what are we saying is okay and what are we saying is not okay? And I think we'd be wiser to come back and approve your motion. I'd vote in favor of it, in conjunction with a definition of what it is we're saying an accessory dwelling unit is. And then from there say, and what are the conditions for building one, or what are the standards as the phase 2 part? But I don't want to conflate, what are we even talking about? I mean, help me understand why that's not a good idea.
So why, if it's okay with the second, why don't we just say, move to direct city manager to replace the words secondary with accessory, comma, and define accessory dwelling in phase 2. And then I agree with you, it's very important. So we don't get that doesn't get lost. It's part of the agenda items of phase 2 that we'll have to deal with, and by motion. So it makes it important.
Is that agreeable with the second?
Yeah.
Just Chris.
Emily wanted to speak to that.
I did just want to point out that it's likely that we're not the only jurisdiction that's going to get appealed. And one of the things that's likely to come out of some of these early cases is what exactly did the state mean? And so we may have some guidance from the courts by the time you get around to really digging into phase 2. So, that doesn't mean you can't do it now, but it's just another, in defining it, you're going to be, again, making sure that you're not imposing something other than a design or a siting standard. What does that mean? That there are some benefits legally to giving yourselves a little time before you do that.
Help me understand what you're saying. I'm not sure what that means.
That right now, we really don't know what it means. It's a state term, and the state is going to end up having to define it either through another legislative action or through courts.
So his motion allows for us to get better advice.
It does. It does. I think you'll be back at it again. If you do it now, you'll be back at it again a second time later.
But it's accurate to say we're getting appealed probably either way.
I think that's true. The question is, do you want to be the one to make the law?
And some of us think that we already comply, and we're going to probably get appealed no matter if we do or don't do, right?
I think that's true.
Okay. So the change makes it better.
I'm done with my part there. Thank you for participating. I have Emily here.
Just quickly, what is the definition of a dwelling unit?
Currently.
Yeah, what has to be in that garage or the detached building, or, what makes it different than just renting a bedroom in my house?
And part of it's building code, which I don't have before me or a lot of knowledge about, but I know that they look for a kitchen typically when they're looking at a dwelling. It's a kitchen and a bathroom, and that's not necessarily what the land use code looks at. A dwelling is defined in the land use code as a building or portion thereof designed and used for a residence for occupancy by one family. This includes both buildings constructed on-site and manufactured homes.
Okay, thank you.
More
Does
discussion.
it have to have a stove in it? Does it have to have a range?
It has to have some kitchen facilities. Again, that's kind of a building code, what the kitchen consists of. So that's not something we define in the land use code.
Because I know some people have made SDUs without the range in it,
And they're probably not SDUs.
and then they get okayed, and then they put the range in it.
So this does happen where folks come in wanting to build a secondary dwelling. They realize what the permitting costs are, what the system development costs are. They revise their plans. They remove any kind of a kitchen. They get approval. We make note that this is not an SDU, and we make big red notes on the plans. And lo and behold, at some point later, it's got a kitchen in it. So, and then they become under enforcement for that.
Is there a definition of kitchen?
Not in the land use code. Again, that's really more of a building code issue.
So is it in the building code?
I don't know that.
All right, thank you.
We can get that for you if you're interested.
Yeah.
Thanks, I am.
More discussion on the motion. Betty.
What will happen differently? Do we need to pass this motion? Does this make a difference in anything today?
Yes. If you pass this motion, it will direct us to come back to you for action with an ordinance that shows the changes from SDU to ADU throughout the code.
But it won't make any difference in what's going to happen.
Oh, no, it won't be a difference on the ground, but I need you to make the motion so we can,
There won't be any 4-house lots.
not with the motion that's on the table now.
That doesn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah, it's not going to create additional accessory
Okay,
dwellings.
thank you.
Before calling on Emily for another second round for the motion, I'm going to ask, when are we scheduled for phase 2?
Yeah, so we're going to come back on May 30th. So in the memo, I described kind of an outline for how several of the recent council motions around housing and housing affordability, we're trying to bring those together into kind of a coherent approach with robust public engagement that's going to deliver to council what you've asked for in terms of a list of actions and what kind of an impact those actions might have on the housing affordability question, some of the pros and cons. We don't have that all fleshed out yet. We're working on it. May 30th, we're going to be coming back on the barriers question, and our intent is to fold this question into that one.
But it is fairly clear that what we're doing in Phase 2 is not so much about complying with 1051 as it is us saying, how do we make this better? Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's correct. So our recommendation is that council will do whatever it is that you feel it needs to be done for compliance with 1051.
Yeah, I think that Phase 2 piece might take a couple of work sessions, but I think this one's productive.
Only two?
Any other discussion? Emily, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So you said that if we change it from SDU to ADU, and so we're changing the name right now, and then you're going to come back and define what it is?
There's probably three things at play right now. One is, yes, that change, we don't need any more direction to just simply make that change. The other part of the motion that's on the table is that as part of Phase 2, you would work and we would propose some language to better define ADU. So that's the motion on the table. The other thing to keep in mind is that you have before you an ordinance that will change to be a definition of dwelling accessory, so accessory dwelling unit, and that will have you adopt what the state definition of ADU is right now. So that's sort of the background piece to the motion on the table.
That's very helpful, but we're anticipating possible changes to the definition of SDU, ADU as we work on the name in Phase 2.
That's what I'm understanding is the proposal.
And if we change those definitions from what we have now to something else, how does that affect anything? What kind of changes, are we talking about? Will it have any interaction with the state law?
I think it's actually an intelligent way to go about it from a legal perspective, that we're aligning ourselves with the state law right now. We may learn some things from the state between now and Phase 2, and we may not. But at Phase 2, then you can decide whether you want to depart a bit from the state law. And right now, if you do nothing on Ordinance 2, we actually have a fine definition, but it isn't exactly the same as state law, and it sort of adds another layer of complexity. So I think the Planning Commission proposal supported by staff is a good one from a legal perspective for Ordinance 2.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
But all we're doing right now, for clarity, is saying we're going to change the words, and we're coming back with a new definition, right?
Yes.
Betty?
So we change the words and we don't know what it means. If we're going to decide what it means later.
No.
Yes.
This doesn't make
Right
sense.
now, it means the same thing
Actually,
it
we
did.
do have a
Yeah.
definition.
Right now, it means what it meant yesterday.
And whatever the courts are going to tell us it means in the next few months.
But you say
Whether or
we're
not
going
it's
to,
actually
but
clear.
a part of the motion was to come back with a definition.
A new one.
A new
As
definition.
New
phase-
definition.
In part of Phase 2.
But we're not adopting the new definition. We're not saying that we will adopt the new definition.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
We may.
I'm asking Emily.
I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question.
We're not committing ourselves to adopting the new definition.
What, if you make, not the definition that you will work on in Phase 2.
Okay.
That'll be a question for you to
Okay.
mull over then, yeah.
And what's going to change in the world if we make this just some words, right?
Yes.
Clarity?
I think
Hopefully.
that's right.
Be like changing your name. You're still the same person, you just have a different name.
But it makes
Like
it
Jane.
extremely clear that we are complying with the
Names are
state
important.
law,
Yeah, they are.
whatever that is.
We're acting to comply in a reasonable fashion.
Yeah.
Any other discussion? Okay. Do we need to restate the motion for anybody? No. All those in favor? Emily? All those in favor? All right. All those opposed? Motion passes 7-0. Do we have consideration of any other motions on the table or discussion? I think it might be actually helpful. Claire?
So we're not going to consider the two motions that are before us?
Yeah,
We just did one so far.
we haven't done anything.
Or did you mean additional motions?
It's up to the
Okay.
It's up to the now acting president of the council if you'd like to
you're
make
still
those
the
motions.
president.
Oh, you're still,
Well, I still don't make the motions though as
You can.
chair.
Yes, you do.
Yes, you do.
You can. You're still the
you're
president.
still the president.
I think that, again, then I will take the liberty of saying that the motions recommended by staff I'm not comfortable with. I think what we just did is what I'm comfortable with.
All right. Can I?
Can I get in the
And
queue,
so
please?
yes, you may.
I'd like
Mayor.
to-
And I would say then that we just had the discussion about what the substance of each of those motions were. But
Can I have my time, please?
Yes, you may, Claire.
you. So I found this very frustrating. I feel like, yes, there was some good discussion. I'm perturbed that we may be putting ourselves in a position for not being in compliance with state law by not adopting these motions today. I really feel that many of the concerns that were raised are not relevant to these motions. Staff has tried to tell us that about 10 times. And I think we should take action on the two motions before us today. I also want to say that when we talk about private property rights, that also should include the right to be able to build another structure on one's property, presuming it does not have outsized negative impacts on other properties nearby, whether that's for additional income or to accommodate a family living arrangement that serves that property owner. We just recently passed big changes to our taxi ordinance, in part because people want to earn extra income with their private vehicles. So I think we need to be mindful of both sides of that question. It's not just about our desire to create more density. It's not about the directives of this council to create more density that I feel we need to be mindful of private property rights on both sides of that question. And then in terms of developing a definition, I think Alan said, you know, we can say what a secondary dwelling unit is, but it's the code that really defines what that means in reality. And so we're not going to find the perfect set of words that's going to capture in a paragraph what an accessory or secondary dwelling unit is. So I'm all right with the motion we just passed. I think that was a good step. I would like us to consider adopting the two motions that council has brought to, staff has brought to us today.
Make the motion.
Mayor?
Yes, I agree with Claire. I think that the point of having two phases was that the first phase was to address where accessory dwelling units could be built, and that was the reason that a list of different neighborhoods was presented. You have not yet voted on that, and that is, I think, a critical part of our compliance with SB 1051. So I also agree that that should come under consideration. That motion should be on the table. You should discuss it. I understand there are some ambivalence about specific special area zones. You can, there can be an amended motion that reflects that, but I do not think you should leave that one unconsidered, without consideration today.
Thank you. Alan?
So I'll move to adopt Council Bill 5184, an ordinance concerning secondary dwellings, which is the first motion.
Second.
Discussion on that motion. Emily?
Emily, is this where I make a friendly amendment?
Yes, so, right. What you've done so far is directed us to revise technically both ordinances to change it to accessory use. Now you can consider whether there are other changes to the ordinance. And which one did you put on the table for my?
First one.
The first one.
2, 3,
518.
that's 2, 3, and 4, right?
Thank
Which is
you.
attachment A.
That's the one about changing R2, R3, R4, et cetera.
It is.
Yes. So I would like to add that SDUs are not allowed in the Jefferson and the Chambers special area zones. Do you want me to read this whole thing?
If you're making a motion, yes.
Okay, I move to direct the city manager to revise the ordinance to add a new subsection 2 to section 9.3615 of the Eugene Code 1971. And the following subsection is to be renumbered to provide as follows. 9.3615 S-JW Jefferson West Side Special Area Zone Land Use and Permit Requirements and Special Use Limitations. The land use and permit requirements and special use limitations in the SJW Jefferson Westside Special Area Zone shall be those set out at EC 9.2740 and EC 9.2741 for uses in the R2 zone, except the following uses listed on Table EC 9.2740 are prohibited in the SJW Jefferson Westside Special Area Zone. 1, correctional facilities. 2, this is the new part, secondary dwellings. And the next paragraph would be renumbered to 3. Is the density part any part?
Is there a
of this?
second to that amendment?
I'll second it.
Discussion of the amendment. Would you like to speak to it, Emily?
As I've said before, I think it's really important to honor the neighborhoods who've put so much effort into this and really feel that it describes the neighborhood they want. I want to honor that. I don't think that SDUs are going to be the same in all the neighborhoods. There's different building requirements in different neighborhoods. I think it's important. People have asked for it, and I don't see how it's going to hurt anybody.
Thank you, Claire. And can I clarify, did both of you also want to be in the queue?
I do.
Okay, not Chris, sorry, thank you. Claire, and then,
So if we adopted this friendly amendment and it passed, would then Jefferson West Side Special Area Zone be the only exception?
Oh, I wanted to add Chambers to it. Sorry.
Oh, I don't think there's a friendly
And
amendment
Chambers.
right now. There's just a motion and a second.
Yeah, it's not a friendly.
So
It's up here.
if you, that's a question for staff, or, would there be other zones?
This one was above.
So the question is this going to carve out an exception just for these two zones, whether it's a friendly amendment or an amendment to the motion?
Would carve out an exception for Jefferson West Side, just to,
and Chambers, right?
But they would be the only the question is, would they be the only exception? Or two exceptions if Chambers gets added?
you mean out of all of the special area zones? Or
Correct.
out of the ones we're proposing them to be included in?
Both. Answer both questions.
I believe they would be the only two that there would be an exception to. I want to clarify that actually secondary dwellings are already allowed in a portion of Chambers. So if you're removing the use totally, that would be problematic. I don't know if, I haven't seen the motion, so, yeah.
That motion doesn't specifically work for Chambers because that's language right from the Jefferson West Side zone.
So
Right.
there's one in section 18 above it.
I can look at
All right, well, that's all for me, thanks.
I've got myself in the queue, and then Jennifer. I'll be voting in favor of the amendment, but against the motion that it goes towards, because if by chance the motion were to pass, I'd want that exception in there, just like I mentioned earlier. But please clarify for me, the motion that Alan made here is the addition of the specific language to R2, R3, and R4, right?
Yeah, as well as AG, special area
Here's
zone.
my challenge with that is that.
Elmira and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Blair.
My challenge with that is exactly what I said before, which is when I asked our lawyer the exact specific question, is does 1051 require us to be explicit? The answer is no. And I don't see the need for the potential consequences that will come from it, unintended consequences, when, in fact, we are complying with 1051 and we already allow it in R1, and I don't want to create this reality where it's a setup for a potential only SDUs get special consideration for incentives. So I will vote against it because I don't believe it's necessary to comply with the law. Others can believe it is necessary. That's completely fine. But I just heard the attorney tell me that. That 1051 does not require us to be explicit there and do that.
Can I jump in the queue?
Yes, ma'am. I have Jennifer, and then I have the mayor.
Me.
Perfect.
You forgot.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Alan, and then the mayor.
So I'm wondering, is there a reason we don't want to include all the special area zones? I mean,
Because they're all not all set up the same way.
yeah. So Yeah, yeah, yes, that's kind of the point, is they're all unique and they've all had time. I would like to see them all be exempt. Yes. I don't see how some are more special than others. If we have a concern about special area zones, I'd like to look at them all in phase 2.
The friendly accepted?
I don't know anything about the other special area zones.
If I could, please, there's been a friendly amendment
So I have to
offered.
yes or no?
Is it-
No.
I think Emily wants to.
Yeah, I know, but I want to just clarify. A friendly amendment was offered. Does the maker of the amendment accept?
I don't have enough information, so no.
Okay. Emily.
So the motion that is on the table was very specific and used exact language and subsections that relate only to the Jefferson West Side Zone. You could do a more general motion to encompass a number of zones, but you can't just say, and another zone related to the motion that was just made. And the specifics for that zone are that it happens to be one of the zones where already you can do 2 single-family dwellings on a lot, which I don't know if that's the case for all the special area zones or not. So it's going to be clearer if you take these zones, either if you're going to go that specific one by one, or a more general motion of the nature that Mike was talking about earlier that would group a number of them together.
Okay, next in the queue, are you finished? I'm sorry, Jennifer. Yeah, I have Alan and then the mayor.
So is Emily's motion an amendment to the first motion or a substitute motion? Or do you want it to be a friendly? 'Cause
It's
I'll
an
accept it.
amendment.
Neither. I mean, you have a draft ordinance in front of you. You took a vote to direct us to bring it back with one change. She's proposing another change in what we bring back.
Before that, I moved to adopt Council Bill 5184. Then she
Okay.
made another motion.
I'm sorry.
motion is to
Yes,
amend
I was-
it
and
to do
there was
that.
an aside. Yes,
Yours
so
needs to be in a motion to amend.
this is a motion to amend the
Right.
main motion, and there are no friendlies.
That's
It was
correct.
made and seconded, so you need to have a vote on the motion to amend.
That's what we have on the
Then we come
table
back
is the
to-
motion.
The main motion.
We have
My
the
apologies.
amendment on the table right now that we're having discussion about.
Yep.
And that was what Jennifer and my comments were directed towards, was the amendment, and I commented towards
Right,
the other.
so this is a
got you.
motion to amend the original motion. And in order for a neighborhood to have a special carve-out, do they have to have a special area zone or refinement plan or some other kind of document that allows that to occur?
Do you want to address that? Do you want me to?
I'm going to let you, because
So the way that the city has approached these special area zones is they each they're like a base zone. They're really no different. R1 and Jefferson West Side, they have their own provisions in the code. There are some references back and forth between them, but what you have is a complete set of regulations for each one of these special area zones, and they're not all drafted the same way. So I think the answer to your question is yes. Each one is unique.
Next question is, so what this initial motion does is it clarifies that in R2, R3, and R4, you can do an accessory dwelling unit. Right now, you could do one, but you would have to call it a secondary dwelling.
you have to call it a second dwelling.
Yeah, which is just confusing. What all this does is just say, in those zones where you could already do this, we're saying you can do an accessory dwelling unit. You could already do it, doesn't change anything, it just makes for more clarity. And so it wouldn't add any more authority for anybody to do anything different. Is that correct? This just makes it clear that when someone says, can I do an accessory dwelling unit in R2, 3, or 4, you would right now have to say no, but you could do a secondary dwelling, which makes no sense, since they could be the same thing. And so what this really does is just clarifies that. So I'm in favor of the motion, I'm in favor of the amendment.
Thank you. Mayor?
Okay, so I'm tracking what Alan just said, but the amended motion is still offering an exemption for Jefferson West Side, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so, I just want to go back a little bit. I think about some of the testimony we've had about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and so I do want to respond a little bit to that, which is that the spirit of the law is that where we have zoning for single-family residential, we allow secondary dwelling units to be, or accessory dwelling units to be built. So, just getting to your point, Mike, about R1, that is definitely the intent of this SB 1051, is that we are allowing this wherever we're allowing single-family residential, and the whole point of this exercise has been to make sure that anywhere that we allow that, we also include this in the code, this allowance. So that said, I guess I'm confused by Alan's comments that, let me step back again. I also appreciate the concern about neighborhoods that have gone through a very disciplined process to create their codes and not wanting to override that. But some of these neighborhood codes are really old. Like some of these neighborhoods haven't done a code, so are we grandfathering in ones that we're grandfathering in Jefferson West Side because it's a more recent code and it addresses this, but we're not going to grandfather in the Whitaker code special area zone because it's so old? I mean, am I missing something here?
They're already allowed in Whitaker.
They're already allowed in
Yeah,
Whitaker.
there's already
Okay.
a number of
Okay.
special area zones where secondary dwelling
It's already allowed.
are already
Okay.
allowed. The amendment or the ordinance would add it to just a few more,
Gotcha. Just
including
a few.
Jefferson West Side. One of them is the Elmira Road Special Area
Right.
Zone, which is actually a low-density residential area. The
Right.
other one is the Blair Boulevard Historic Special Area Zone, which is a mixed-use area.
Okay,
Similar to
got the
Whitaker.
list right in front of me. Okay, so we make an exemption for Southwest Jefferson West Side, but we are leaving the R2, which apparently is the language that relates to Jefferson West Side. So R2 would apply elsewhere, but Jefferson West Side would have an exemption.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, based on the motion.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Betty?
I will vote for the amendment and against the motion. Another momentous occasion when I agree with Mike.
Chris?
If we pass the main motion, whether or not it's amended, will that immediately allow people to build more units in these zones?
The zones that it would allow people, I mean, right now, they're not allowed at all. You cannot have a second dwelling of any type in agricultural. So that would be one zone where maybe we would see more. There's not a ton of agricultural land out there. Most people want to rezone it to its highest and best use. You're still limited in density in R2, R3, and R4.
Okay, so the original question I've asked a couple of
Right,
times
yeah,
already
yeah.
is, this is for clarification not to allow more building.
Correct.
And it's not your effort to try to sneak in a way to build more units.
Correct. I live in the neighborhoods too. I mean, I care. I mean, I'm not just, we're not over here just trying to, stealthily insert secondary dwellings in
So it really is in an effort to clarify our code and land use law so it's more understandable and in alignment with what the state is doing.
Yes.
That's really what your intent is.
Yes.
Okay. The amendment, if it were to pass, would continue something that is already in place, or would it change something that's already in place?
I think it would continue something that's already in place. It would really have no effect. If you add it to R2 as a secondary dwelling unit, you couldn't call your second house in Jefferson West Side a secondary dwelling or accessory dwelling unit.
Okay. That helps. I didn't know exactly what to do on the amendment. I guess it sounds like if I support the amendment, that's not going to really change anything. But I do believe we need to go ahead and pass the original motion for clarification purposes particularly in light of the fact it's not really going to change the actual building of units, but it does provide something that's very important to me, which is much greater clarity, not only at the local level, but also in our alignment with the state.
Thank you. I noticed that we have less than a half of a minute left to dispose of this. I've just had advice from our attorney that maybe this is complex enough that we want to come back and see it all in front of us before voting and maybe table it, which is an interesting idea.
What I think would be good is to go ahead and take action on the amendment, the proposed amendment, to see whether that passes or not. And what we would like to do is come back with the revisions we know you've already voted on, which would be the change from SDU to ADU, and bring that back for council action at another work session date.
Including the motion that Alan put on the table.
Alan's motion is moved to adopt, and so I would prefer that you not act on that motion at this point. And so what would be good is to,
See the complete motion as it's amended, if it's amended.
And then bring it back.
yeah, it would be helpful if you would take action on Counselor Semple's motion so we know whether or not that has legs, and whether to add that to the ordinance that we bring back to you. And then,
Postpone to a date certain.
yes, and I don't know if Christie can help us with that, but maybe if you could go ahead and take care of the amendment.
Is there more discussion on the amendment? All those in favor, please raise your hand. All those opposed, passes unanimously.
Okay.
We need a motion to extend for a couple minutes here.
Oh, I was going to make a motion to postpone.
We need a motion
Motion to
to,
extend 5 minutes.
Second.
all those in favor? Passes unanimously. So now we have an opportunity, and I heard Betty first, and then I'll hear Emily on a potential motion.
I move to postpone to, do we need a date?
I'm looking at possibilities June 11th.
To June 11th, okay.
Do we not have time at a sooner meeting?
We would have to talk about bumping some other things, so.
Yeah, because there's going to be a discussion.
To the next available work session opportunity, maybe?
Yeah, let's say that.
Okay,
So,
change it to that, and then we need a second, though.
Second.
Discussion on the motion to postpone. All
I want
those
to
in,
make sure the city attorney is comfortable with tabling it in that way,
postponing it in that way.
postponing it to next available. Thank you.
All those in favor? All those opposed? Passes unanimously.
Okay.
Thank you. I believe we are done. Oh, Emily, please.
What about the Chambers special area zone? Would we add that later, or do I need to make a motion today?
I think we could, I mean, you got a couple more minutes. You could make it and see if that one goes as well.
I'm going to make a motion. Can I read the whole bunch again?
I think it's fair to say, and that
As submitted? It's in writing?
that you would move to direct the city manager to further revise the ordinance to include the Chambers special area zone in the same, with the same general exception that was passed for the Jefferson West Side special area zone.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion to the motion. Alan?
Why?
Same reason,
When was their plan?
same reason as Jefferson, they were asked together, but, it started with one. There's the same request. It says, the land use and permit requirements and special use limitations applicable in the SC R2 subarea shall be those set out at EC 9.2740 and EC 9.2741 for uses in the R2 zone, and here's the new part, except that secondary dwellings shall not be allowed.
And so, staff, the effect of this motion is the same, that it wouldn't change anything that exists right now.
Correct. I mean, if
It would
the
just-
lot's eligible for a second single-family dwelling, they could continue to do that. We just wouldn't recognize it as a secondary dwelling or an accessory dwelling.
And it wouldn't expand, it wouldn't allow, if we didn't pass this, would that allow for the expansion of potential lots where
No.
ADUs could be?
No, this doesn't, I mean, it doesn't have any effect on the number of units that could be allowed. Those are spelled
number of
out.
lots that
Right.
would be potentially available for an ADU.
Right.
would be.
Ask that again, I'm sorry.
Would this increase, if you voted against this, would turning this down increase the number of lots where an ADU would be potentially built?
No, in that, I mean, if you go back to the logic that was used earlier, if these lots already allow a second single-family dwelling, this isn't going to allow, an ADU on top of that. It would just allow it in lieu of that.
Right.
So if it allows 2 dwellings now, by passing the ordinance before you, you could still have 2 dwellings. It's just whether the second one is its own single-family dwelling or is it an accessory dwelling.
So this is this just a special recognition? Because it has no effect. I'm wondering what the purpose of the amendment is.
I think it comes back to the density, and I'd have another possible motion regarding density. That
We're not changing density. Nobody's even suggested.
Ask that it be clarify that SDUs are included in density calculations, particularly in special area zones where SDUs are being added through this ordinance.
It's already the code.
But that's not, that isn't, are we finished now? Or-
Well, no, she didn't answer my question, which is, so what's the point of this? I mean,
Well, it's the same as the Jefferson one. They've asked for it, and their concerns are the density. You don't have to vote for it.
doesn't make any difference, so it doesn't make any difference which way you vote.
Are you done?
And just one more point. I don't know. Making a motion to clarify what the code already says, we're already past time, so I'll leave it at that.
Chris?
My questions were answered.
I will vote in favor of the amendment for the same reason, in that I remember voting to pass both of these special area zones on council. I remember the work done by the neighborhoods. I want to respect it. It was not that very long ago that we passed these unanimously at council, because the neighbors took a ton of time, just like they're doing in River Road and around the university, to say, this is how we'd like to see development happen in our neighborhood. We asked them, they did the refinement plans, and I want to respect that. Any other discussion? All those in favor of this amendment, please show, yeah. All those opposed? It's 7-0, we pass. Is there other business? No. We are adjourned today.